The first round punched through the canvas 3 inches above Katherine Brennan's head. She was already moving before the sound registered, dropping the morphine syringe, rolling off the cot, pulling Private Rodriguez down with her as the second burst tore through the medical tent. Muzzle flash strobed through the blizzard outside. Men screaming in a language she recognized from a life she'd buried. And underneath it all, the sound she'd been dreading for 3 years. The mechanical thunder of an AK pattern rifle on full auto. Katherine pressed her palm against Rodriguez's chest, feeling his heart hammer through the blood-soaked bandages. "Stay down," she whispered. "Don't move. Don't speak." His eyes were wild with morphine and terror. 19 years old. Shrapnel in his abdomen from an IED 2 days ago. He'd been asking for his mother in his sleep. Now he might never see her again. Katherine's hands weren't shaking. That was the first warning sign. They should have been shaking. Any normal nurse, any normal person would be trembling right now. The temperature outside was -15 Celsius and dropping. Wind screamed through gaps in the corrugated metal walls at 50 miles per hour. Visibility was 10 feet, maybe less. And somewhere in that frozen hell, armed men were breaching a field hospital that had exactly 0 combat personnel on duty. But Katherine's hands were steady. Rock steady. Sniper steady. The muscle memory was flooding back. 11 years of training for combat deployments. A body count she stopped tracking somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan. She could feel the old calculations running beneath her conscious mind. Wind speed, distance to threat, cover positions, engagement sequences. No, she killed that woman. She buried her. Katherine pressed her forehead against the frozen floor and forced herself to breathe. She was a nurse now, a healer. She'd spent 3 years building this identity, stitching together wound by wound, patient by patient. She'd held dying soldiers and told them they'd be okay. She'd cleaned bedpans and changed 4 bags and pretended she didn't know the exact trigger pull weight of an M24. 3 pounds, smooth, like pushing through butter. She wasn't that person anymore. Another burst of gunfire. Closer now. Someone screaming in English. Dr. Okonkwo. She recognized a voice. The Nigerian surgeon who taught her to suture one-handed when supplies ran low. He was begging. Katherine closed her eyes. If that opening hooked you, trust me, this story only gets more intense. Subscribe now for more real stories of courage and hit that notification bell. Now, let me take you back 12 hours to where it all began. The field hospital had been dying long before the insurgents arrived. 12 hours earlier, Katherine stood at the entrance of the main medical tent, watching the supply convoy's scheduled arrival time come and go. The radio had been silent for 6 hours, unusual but not unprecedented in this frozen dead zone, where borders meant nothing and Geneva Conventions were suggestions written by men who'd never known real cold. The hospital was never supposed to last this long. 2 weeks, they'd said. Emergency medical support for a peacekeeping operation, while diplomats negotiated in warm conference rooms 3,000 miles away. That was 3 months ago. The peace talks had collapsed. The diplomats had gone home. And somehow, Katherine and a skeleton crew of medical personnel were still here, burning through supplies, praying for extraction, treating an endless stream of casualties from a war that officially didn't exist. Tonight's roster: 14 patients, 3 doctors, 6 nurses, 8 support staff, 19 souls in a canvas and metal structure held together by wire desperation, and Katherine's carefully maintained belief that she could be something other than what she was trained to be. She checked her watch. 2100 hours. The convoy was 4 hours overdue. "You're doing that thing again," said Dr. Sarachun, appearing at Katherine's shoulder with 2 cups of coffee that had been reheated so many times they turned into something closer to motor oil. The staring thing, like you're calculating firing solutions. Katherine accepted the cup without turning. "I don't know what you mean. You spent 45 minutes yesterday watching the North approach. The exposed one, where an attack would most likely come from." Sarah sipped her coffee. "And last week, you reorganized the supply room so the heaviest equipment is blocking the weakest entry point." "I was organizing. You were fortifying." Katherine finally looked at her. Sarachun was 53 years old, Harvard-trained, and had spent 20 years in combat medicine. She'd seen enough field nurses to know when one of them was hiding something. She just didn't know what. Old habits, Katherine said. "Army brat. My father was infantry. He used to make us clear the house before dinner." It wasn't entirely a lie. Her father had been infantry. He'd also been the one who'd recognized her gift, the preternatural stillness, the ability to slow her heartbeat on command, the eyes that could pick out movement at distances most people couldn't even focus. He'd written her first recommendation letter to sniper school. He'd also been the one who'd found her in the shower 3 years ago, fully clothed, water running cold, staring at hands that wouldn't stop trembling no matter how hard she squeezed them. 27 confirmed kills had finally broken something inside her. She'd requested a transfer to medical services, spent 18 months retraining, and had volunteered for every remote assignment available until she'd ended up here, a frozen nowhere, treating wounds instead of inflicting them. 3 years of healing, 3 years of pretending. And now the convoy was late, the radio was silent, and Katherine couldn't stop watching the North approach. She'd noticed the first warning sign at 1400 hours. The guards had rotated early. Staff Sergeant Morrison and his 3-man security detail had been pulled back to the main base 12 hours ahead of schedule, replaced by a single local contractor who disappeared into the blizzard 90 minutes later and never returned. Katherine had said nothing. She'd learned a long time ago that enlisted medical personnel who raised tactical concerns were either ignored or suspected, but she'd started making preparations. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would mark her. She'd moved 2 cases of saline to the supply shed on the compound south side, creating a reason to know the terrain. She'd checked the maintenance scaffolding behind the generator building, 20 feet high steel frame with a clear sight line to the main gate. She'd counted the oil lamps, memorized the locations of fire extinguishers, noted which her colleagues could run and which would freeze. At 1900 hours, the encrypted radio burst had sealed it. She hadn't been supposed to hear it. She'd been in the communications tent, borrowing gauze from Specialist Torres. When the burst came through, 3 seconds of static that wasn't static. It was a compressed transmission on a frequency that shouldn't have been active. Insurgent chatter. Coordinate confirmation. The hospital was being targeted. Katherine had quietly finished her inventory, walked back to the main tent, and started her shift. She couldn't warn them. That was the hell of it. She couldn't walk up to Dr. Okonkwo and explain that she recognized encrypted insurgent radio protocols because she'd spent 2 years hunting cells across the Afghan mountains. She couldn't tell Sarah Chun that they needed to evacuate because the supply convoy wasn't late. It had been intercepted. Any explanation would require revealing who she'd been. And if Katherine Brennan, night nurse, suddenly transformed into Master Sergeant Katherine Brennan, sniper qualified on 6 weapons platforms with a kill radius measured in kilometers, everything she'd built would be over. The carefully constructed identity, the healing, the desperate hope that she could be something other than a human weapon. So she said nothing. She just watched. By 2200 hours, the blizzard had intensified to whiteout conditions. The temperature had dropped to -18 Celsius, and the wind was tearing at the canvas walls like something alive and hungry. Most of the staff had retreated to the warmest corners of the hospital, clustering around oil lamps and battery-powered LED strips. Katherine worked the night shift alone. She moved between patients with mechanical efficiency, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, administering the last of their ration morphine. 14 patients in various states of critical, 3 amputees, 2 burn victims, 1 skull fracture, and in the private corner of the ICU, separated from the others by a blood-stained curtain, lay the man who would get them all killed. Colonel James Garrett, 54 years old, career officer, intelligence background. He'd been brought in 8 days ago with a shattered femur and 3 cracked ribs, injuries from a vehicle rollover, officially. But Katherine had overheard enough to know the truth. 3 weeks ago, Garrett had authorized an airstrike on a village called Mirabad. Intelligence had flagged it as an insurgent command center. The strike had been clean, efficient, and catastrophically wrong. 212 civilians dead. Women, children, 3 generations of families wiped out in 90 seconds of precision-guided munitions. The official investigation was ongoing. Garrett claimed the intelligence had been solid. Survivors claimed he'd known exactly what he was hitting. Either way, he was the most wanted man in this sector, and someone had told the insurgents exactly where to find him. Katherine stood at Garrett's bedside, watching him sleep. Morphine-induced unconsciousness. He looked peaceful, almost innocent, the face of a man who authorized airstrikes on villages and slept soundly afterward. She wondered if her own face looked like that now. 27 confirmed kills. How many families had she destroyed? How many Mirabads had she created, one trigger pull at a time? The guilt was always there, beneath the surface. 3 years of healing, and she still couldn't outrun it. Her watch read 22:45. In 32 minutes, she would have to choose who she wanted to be. She'd been the best in her class. Not the strongest, not the fastest, but the stillest, the quietest, the one who could lie in a frozen creek bed for 8 hours without moving, without shivering, without letting her mind wander from the single point of focus 300 meters downrange. Sniper school had been where Katherine learned what she was. Not who she was. What? A biological machine optimized for one specific purpose, putting a small piece of metal through a small piece of human being from a distance where they couldn't even hear the shot that killed them. Her instructors had called it a gift. She called it a curse. But she'd been good at it. Too good. The Army didn't let you walk away from gifts like that. They fed you targets and watched you eliminate them and told you that you were protecting freedom while you turned human beings into confirmed kills on a classified spreadsheet. Norway had been the turning point. 7 years ago, a joint NATO exercise in winter warfare conditions. 2 weeks in the Arctic, practicing long-range engagement in environments that would kill most shooters before they ever reached their firing position. Katherine had loved it. The cold had sharpened her. The wind had become another variable to calculate. And on the final day of the exercise, she'd made a shot that still lived in her nightmares. 600 meters. Whiteout conditions. Wind at 40 kilometers per hour with gusts that shifted unpredictably. Temperature of negative 23 Celsius. Her spotter had called the shot impossible. Conditions too severe. Target too obscured. Katherine had taken the shot anyway. Center mass. Clean hit. The target, a ballistic mannequin rigged with sensors, registered lethal impact. Her commanding officer had put her in for a commendation. The Norwegian observers had called her the best marksman they'd ever seen. And Katherine had gone back to her barracks, locked herself in the latrine, and thrown up until she was empty, because she'd finally understood what she was. Not a soldier, not a patriot, not a protector, a predator. Evolution had spent millions of years creating the perfect killing machine, and somehow all that genetic engineering had ended up in a 5'7" woman from Minnesota with quiet hands and eyes that didn't blink. She'd kept serving after that. 2 more deployments, 13 more kills, each one easier than the last, which was the worst part. The guilt should have gotten heavier. Instead, it got lighter. She was becoming what they'd trained her to be. And then the 27th kill happened. Katherine never talked about it, never told anyone. The classified file said, confirmed enemy combatant eliminated at range of 412 meters. What the file didn't say was that the combatant had been running toward the American position, not away from it. Didn't say that she'd been waving something white. Didn't say that Katherine had hesitated for 2 full seconds, an eternity in sniper time, before her finger had completed the 3-pound trigger pull anyway. The white thing had been a medical bandage. The combatant had been trying to surrender. Fog of war. Bad intel. Tragic but unavoidable. The Army had investigated. The Army had cleared her. The Army had told her to take a few weeks of leave and come back ready for deployment. Instead, Katherine had come back broken. 3 years of therapy. 3 years of retraining. 3 years of trying to become someone else. And now she stood in a frozen field hospital, watching the storm tear at canvas walls, knowing that everything she'd built was about to be tested. Her watch read 2,300 hours, 17 minutes until the breach. Katherine made her final rounds at 23:10. She moved through the hospital with the efficiency of long practice, checking each patient, confirming each connection, memorizing each face. Private Rodriguez with his stomach wounds, Corporal Davies with the burns that had eaten half his face, the young female translator, Amira, 22 years old, a bullet through her shoulder that had missed the artery by 3 millimeters, and Garrett, still sleeping his morphine sleep, unaware that men were coming to kill him. At 23:12, Katherine stopped at the supply room. The heaviest equipment was already in place. She'd moved there days ago, creating a barricade that looked accidental. But now she added something else. A 30-inch steel crowbar, approximately 8 pounds, wedged behind a stack of medical crates where she could reach in under 2 seconds. She'd told herself it was just a precaution. She was lying, and she knew it. At 23:14, the generator flickered. Katherine froze. The lights stuttered, casting the hospital in strobe-flash shadows. Then they stabilized. But in that moment of darkness, she'd heard something through the howl of the blizzard. Footsteps. Multiple. Moving in formation. The sound of professional military discipline. Katherine's heart rate dropped. Not elevated. Dropped. From 72 beats per minute to 58. Automatic response. Her body knew what was coming before her mind admitted it. She moved to the nearest window, a plastic-covered gap in the metal wall, and pressed her eye to a tear in the sheeting. The blizzard swallowed everything beyond 10 feet, but she could see shapes moving in the darkness. Shadows that didn't match the storm. 7, maybe 8 figures approaching from a north gate. Another 2 circling toward the generator building. 10 hostiles. 2-team formation. Professional spacing. This wasn't a random attack. This was an operation. Katherine's hands found the surgical scissors in her pocket. Stainless steel. For inches. Sharp enough to cut through suture thread. Sharp enough to cut through a trachea. No, she wasn't that person anymore. But the scissors stayed in her hand. At 23:16, the north gate exploded inward. Not explosives, just bodies. 3 men crashed through the wire-reinforced entrance, AK pattern rifles raised, flashlights blinding. They were wearing civilian clothes under military-grade tactical vests, for spare magazines each. Night vision equipment, though useless in the wideout. And leading them was a man in his mid-30s with the controlled movements of someone who'd spent time in uniform. "Everyone on the ground!" The leader screamed in heavily accented English. "Hands where we can see them. Anyone moves. Anyone reaches for anything, you die." The hospital erupted into chaos. Dr. Okonkwo was the first to comply, dropping to his knees with his hands raised. Nurses screamed. Patients who could move tried to roll off their cots. The insurgents spread out with practiced efficiency, kicking weapons that didn't exist, binding hands with zip ties, establishing control over the space in under 30 seconds. Professional, disciplined, terrifying. Katherine didn't move. She stood in the shadow of the supply room doorway, watching the breach unfold, her mind running calculations she'd sworn she'd never run again. 10 hostiles. 7 inside, 3 outside. 1 LMG operator visible near the north gate, providing overwatch. 2 younger fighters flanking the leader, nervous, jumpy, fingers too close to triggers. The leader himself was calm. Too calm. He wasn't here for random violence. He was here for someone specific. The leader strode to the hospital, his boots crunching on frozen mud and blood. He checked each patient, lifting blankets, examining faces. When he reached Garrett's cot, he stopped and smiled. "There you are," he said softly. "Colonel James Garrett, the butcher of Mirabad." The leader's name, Katherine would learn later, was Razin. He'd been a captain in the National Army before the Civil War splintered it into a dozen competing factions. His wife had been a schoolteacher. His daughter had been 7 years old. They'd both been in Mirabad the night Garrett's airstrike turned the village into a crater. Now Razin stood over the man who'd killed his family. And for a moment, Katherine saw something she recognized in his eyes. Grief, raw and bottomless. The kind that hollowed you out and left nothing but purpose. She understood that grief. She'd felt it herself, standing over the body of the woman who'd been trying to surrender. The white bandage stained red, the face that would haunt her dreams forever. Razin wasn't a monster. He was a father who'd buried his daughter. That didn't mean Katherine could let him kill everyone in this hospital. "Pull him up," Razin ordered. 2 insurgents grabbed Garrett, dragging him from his cot. The colonel woke screaming, his shattered femur grinding against the improvised splint. And the sound was horrible. Animal. The sound of a man whose body had become his enemy. "You know who I am?" Razin asked. Garrett's eyes focused through the pain. Recognition flickered. "Fear. I know who you think you are." Razin hit him. Open palm across the face. Not rage, control violence. A message. "I think I'm the man whose wife cooked dinner for orphans 3 times a week. I think I'm the man whose daughter wanted to be a doctor. Razan's voice didn't waver. And I think you murdered them with a button press from 30,000 feet because someone told you there might be insurgents hiding in their village. Intelligence indicated. Intelligence was wrong. Razan screamed it. The composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the abyss beneath. 212 people, Colonel. Women who'd never held a weapon. Children who were sleeping in their beds. And you slept fine that night, didn't you? You filed your report and ate your breakfast and went on living while we buried what was left of our families. Katherine closed her eyes. She understood. God help her, she understood. 27 confirmed kills. How many innocent people had she turned into collateral damage? How many Razans had she created with her 3-pound trigger pulls? But understanding didn't change what had to happen. Razan was going to kill Garrett. That was obvious. But he wasn't going to stop there. There were witnesses now, staff who'd seen his face, patients who could identify him. If he wanted to disappear after this, he'd have to eliminate everyone. 19 people. Her colleagues, her patients, her purpose. Katherine's hand found the scissors in her pocket. Then she noticed the surgical tape. At 23:24, Razan began his interrogation. He'd separated the staff from the patients, lining them against the far wall with their hands zip-tied behind their backs. The younger insurgents patrolled the space, rifles ready, while the LMG operator outside maintained his position near the gate. Katherine had allowed herself to be bound with the others. The scissors were hidden in her sleeve. The surgical tape she grabbed held them in place. She was the fifth person from the left. Dr. Okonkwo was to her right, breathing in short, terrified gasps. Sarah Chun was to her left, utterly silent, her face a mask of calculated stillness. Sarah had seen something. Katherine was sure of it, the way the older doctor kept glancing at her, then away. The questions unasked in her eyes. I want to know who told you he was here, Razan was saying to Garrett. Who arranged your transport? Who knew you were coming? Someone in this hospital has been communicating with outside forces, and I want their name. I don't know what you're talking about. Razan him again. Harder this time. Garrett's head snapped back, and blood sprayed from his nose. Someone informed us of your exact location, Colonel. They knew which cot you'd be in. They knew what time the security rotation would leave you vulnerable. They're the reason I'm standing here instead of freezing in the mountains, waiting for another chance. Katherine filed the information away. Inside help, one of the staff, probably, or maybe someone at the main base who'd accessed the patient roster. It didn't matter right now. What mattered was a young insurgent standing 6 feet to her left, his AK held at a nervous angle, his attention fixed on Razan's interrogation rather than the hostages. Sloppy. He was maybe 20 years old. First operation, probably. The way he kept shifting his weight, the way his fingers danced near the trigger. He was terrified and trying not to show it. Katherine could take him. The scissors in her sleeve. A pivot, a strike to the throat, catch the rifle before it hits the ground. The other hostiles would react in approximately 1.5 seconds. She'd have that long to identify the next target and engage. But then what? She'd be exposed. Out of cover. One rifle against 9 hostiles with better positioning. The math didn't work. She'd kill 2, maybe 3, before they cut her down. And then everyone else would die anyway. She needed a better position. She needed elevation. The maintenance scaffolding behind the generator building. 20 feet high. Clear sight line to the compound. If she could get there, if she could get a rifle with ammunition, she could engage from a position that negated their numerical advantage. Whiteout conditions. Negative 20 degrees. 50-mile-per-hour winds. 10-foot visibility. 600 meters in Norway. This would be 40, maybe 50 at most. She could do it. Katherine began working the zip tie against the scissors hidden in her sleeve. At 23:31, Razan made his announcement. He'd grown tired of Garrett's denials. The colonel was slumped in a pool of his own blood, barely conscious, the broken femur now visibly displaced beneath the torn splint. He was going to die anyway. Infection, shock, internal bleeding. Razan was just accelerating the timeline. You have all seen too much, Razan said to the assembled hostages. That is not your fault, but it is your reality. I am not a monster. I take no pleasure in what happens next. But Colonel Garrett must face justice for what he did to my people, and none of you can be allowed to interfere with that justice." He paused. "I will offer you this mercy. It will be quick. You will feel nothing, and your bodies will be treated with respect." Dr. Okonkwo began to sob. One of the younger insurgents, the nervous one, looked uncomfortable. His rifle dipped slightly, the muzzle pointing toward the floor rather than the hostages. He was the weak link, the conscience that hadn't been fully burned out yet. Katherine noted his position, 15 feet away. 2 steps as she was fast. But Razum wasn't finished. "First, however, I need information." He pointed at one of the staff, Specialist Torres, the communications technician who'd been borrowing gauze when Katherine heard the encrypted transmission. "You, the radio operator, you're going to tell me exactly what frequencies this hospital uses and how to jam them, or I start with the patients." Torres was shaking so badly he could barely stand. I can't, please, I have a family." "So did I." Razum raised his rifle and pointed it at Torres's forehead. Katherine's zip tie snapped. She didn't think, didn't plan. The 3-pound trigger pull happened before her conscious mind could intervene. Except it wasn't a trigger. It was her body, launching from the wall, scissors already in her grip. 1 step. 2. The young insurgent turned toward her, eyes widening, rifle coming up. Too slow. Katherine's left hand caught the barrel, pushing it aside. Her right drove the scissors into the junction between his neck and shoulder, the subclavian artery. For inches deep, a killing wound that would bleed out in under 90 seconds. He made a sound like a trapped animal. She was already past him, catching the rifle as it fell, her body moving in patterns that had been burned into muscle memory by a decade of training. Index finger found the trigger. Thumb checked the selector. Full auto. Magazine capacity, 30 rounds. The other hostiles were reacting now, heads turning, rifles coming up, the advantage of surprise measured in milliseconds. Katherine didn't waste them. She dove behind a stack of medical crates, rolling, coming up at a crouch with the rifle shouldered. The nearest insurgent, older, disciplined, already tracking her position, caught 2 rounds center mass before he could complete his pivot. He went down hard, AK clattering across the frozen floor. 7 remaining inside, 3 outside. 6.5 seconds since she'd moved. "Contact rear," someone screamed in Dari. "Contact rear." Gunfire erupted. Rounds tore through the crates above Katherine's head, sending splinters of wood and plastic spraying across her face. She stayed low, breathing slow, counting muzzle flashes. 3 shooters engaging her position. The others were focused on hostages, either using them as shields or preparing to execute them. She needed to move. Now, Katherine rolled left, rising into a sprint that carried her toward the supply room. Rounds tracked behind her, punching through canvas and corrugated metal. Someone was screaming, one of the patients, maybe, or one of her colleagues. She couldn't think about that. Couldn't afford the distraction. The supply room entrance was 3 meters away. She dove through it as a burst of automatic fire shredded the air where her head had been. The crowbar was exactly where she'd left it. Katherine dropped the AK, magazine nearly empty, 6 rounds at most, and grabbed the steel bar with both hands. 30 inches of hardened metal. 8 pounds of blunt force trauma waiting to happen. The first insurgent through the door died before he saw her move. She came at him from the side, the crowbar whistling through the air in a horizontal arc that connected with his temple. The sound was wrong, wet, crunching, final. He collapsed without a sound, his rifle discharging once into the floor as dead fingers spasmed on the trigger. Katherine didn't pause. She stripped the tactical vest from his body, for spare magazines, a knife, an LED flashlight, and grabbed his AK, fresh weapon, full load. The doorway behind her was still exposed. Muzzle flashes strobed to the hospital's interior, accompanied by screaming and the thunder of automatic fire. She couldn't go back that way. Too many shooters, too little cover. But there was another exit. The supply room's north wall was corrugated metal, held in place by bolts that had rusted in the constant damp. Katherine had noticed it weeks ago. A maintenance access point, probably sealed shut long before the hospital was established. She didn't bother with the bolts. The crowbar found the gap between panels. 1 pull, muscle screaming, and the metal shrieked as it tore free. A 2-foot opening. Enough. Katherine squeezed through and stepped into the blizzard. The The cold was a physical assault. -20 Celsius with a wind chill that made it feel like -40. The wind hit her like a wall, trying to tear the rifle from her hands, trying to push her down into the snow. Visibility dropped to nothing. She couldn't see the generator building 15 feet away, but she'd memorized the terrain. Katherine moved to the wideout on instinct, counting steps, tracking the wind direction, her breath freezing on her lips before it could fully escape. The maintenance scaffolding was behind the generator building. 20 feet of steel frame with a platform at the top, a sniper's perch, if she could reach it. The first step was the hardest. The snow was knee-deep encrusted with ice, each movement requiring effort that burned through her reserves. Her scrub provided no insulation. She was dying out here, losing body heat with every second, and she didn't care. There were 19 people inside that hospital. Her colleagues, her patients, her purpose. She would save them, or she would die trying. The generator building materialized out of the white. A concrete block with diesel tanks on the south side and exhaust vents on the north. Katherine circled it, feeling her way along the frozen metal until her hands found the scaffolding. Steel rungs covered in ice. 20 feet to the platform. She started climbing. Her fingers went numb after the first 10 feet. The wind nearly tore her from the ladder twice. The rifle slung across her back caught on frozen supports, throwing off her balance. But she kept climbing, kept reaching, kept pulling herself toward the height she needed. At 20 feet, she found the platform. It was a 3x6 rectangle of steel grating, exposed to the wind from every direction, with a clear view of the hospital compound's north entrance. In training, she called positions like this coffin nest sniper hides that were impossible to retreat from if your position was compromised. Tonight, she called it home. Katherine settled onto the platform, the rifle coming up to her shoulder in a motion so familiar it hurt. The old posture returned without thought. Prone position, left hand supporting the stock, right hand wrapped around the grip with her index finger resting outside the trigger guard. Controlled breathing, slow heartbeat, the world narrowing to a single point of focus. She couldn't see the compound. The blizzard erased everything beyond 10 feet, but she could hear it. Muffled gunfire, shouting voices carried on the wind, the generator below her rumbling in its concrete shell. And somewhere in that chaos, 19 people who didn't know they had a guardian angel. Katherine closed her eyes. When she opened them, she was someone else. The first shot came at 23:47. A shape emerged from the blizzard. One of the outside guards, moving from the north gate toward the hospital entrance. He was 35 meters away, barely visible through the driving snow, his AK held at low ready. Katherine watched him for 3 seconds, tracked his movement, calculated the wind, 50 miles per hour from the northwest. At this range, she needed to aim approximately 4 inches right of center mass to compensate for drift. The blizzard would scatter the sound. He wouldn't hear the shot that killed him. Her finger found the trigger. 3 pounds of pressure. The rifle barked once. The guard went down like a puppet with cut strings. Clean hit, center chest, adjusted for wind. No cry, no stumble, just a sudden transition from vertical to horizontal that marked the end of a human life. 1 down, 9 remaining. Katherine worked the bolt. Wait, no. This was an AK. Semi-auto, no bolt work required. And scanned for the next target. The LMG operator was still at his position near the gate, but he hadn't reacted to the shot. The wind had hidden it. Good. She took aim. The LMG operator was the most dangerous target outside. He was positioned behind a makeshift barricade of sandbags and metal sheeting, his light machine gun covering the hospital's main entrance. If Katherine didn't eliminate him, any rescue attempt would turn into a massacre. He was 45 meters away, partially obscured by the blizzard, moving occasionally to stamp warmth into his feet. She waited until he moved again. The shot caught him in the upper chest, just below the throat. He fell backward, his fingers spasming on the trigger, and the LMG fired a wild burst into the sky before going silent. 2 down, 8 remaining. Inside the hospital, someone was screaming orders. Razan's voice, she thought, though the wind distorted everything. The shooting had stopped. They'd either taken control of the hostages or they'd realized something was wrong. Probably both. Katherine scanned for the third exterior guard. He should have been positioned somewhere on the compound's east side, covering the secondary approach. But the blizzard was too thick. She couldn't see him. She waited. Patience was the sniper's greatest weapon. The urge to move, to act, to engage, that was what got shooters killed. The ones who survived were the ones who could lie still for hours, waiting for the perfect shot, their heartbeats slowing to match the rhythm of the hunt. Katherine had once spent 11 hours in a hide site, watching a target building through a 6-inch gap in a wall of rubble. The shot, when it came, had taken less than a second. The waiting had taken nearly half a day. Tonight, she didn't have 11 hours. She had minutes at most before the cold killed her or the insurgents found her position, but she could wait for 30 seconds. At 28 seconds, the third guard emerged from the blizzard. He was moving fast, sprinting, actually heading for the hospital entrance. He'd heard the shooting stop. He knew something was wrong. He was trying to rejoin his team. Katherine tracked him for 1.5 seconds, led the target by 8 inches to compensate for movement, pulled the trigger. The round caught him in the hip, spinning him around. He went down hard, screaming, his rifle flying from his grip. Wounded, not dead. Mistake. Katherine adjusted her aim and fired again. The screaming stopped. 3 down, 7 remaining. All inside. Time to move. The climb down from the platform was worse than the climb up. Her hands were completely numb now, wooden things that barely responded to commands. The ice on the rungs had gotten thicker, and twice she slipped, catching herself by jamming her body against the scaffolding frame. The rifle slung across her back felt like it weighed 100 pounds. At the bottom, she collapsed into snow and let herself breathe for 5 seconds. 5 seconds. That was all she could afford. Then she was up and moving, circling the generator building, heading for the tear she'd made in the supply room wall. The hostiles inside didn't know her position. They didn't know how many they were facing. That confusion was her greatest advantage. She intended to exploit it. The supply room was empty when she slipped back through the hole. The body of the insurgent she'd killed with a crowbar was still crumpled in the doorway, his blood frozen in black pools around his head. Katherine stepped over him without looking. The hospital's interior was a war zone. Medical equipment had been overturned. Cots were scattered. Blood was everywhere, some from the insurgents she'd killed, some from patients who'd been caught in the crossfire. The smell of cordite and copper filled the air, mixing with the ever-present scent of antiseptic and human suffering. Katherine moved through the chaos like a ghost. The hostages were still against the far wall. She could see most of them. The insurgents had pulled 3 of them, Dr. Okonkwo, Sarah Chun, and a nurse Katherine didn't recognize, to the center of the room, using them as human shields. The remaining 7 insurgents were positioned in a defensive formation, rifles pointing outward, covering every approach. Razin was in the center, Garrett's unconscious body at his feet. "I know you're still here," he shouted into the darkness. 1 woman against 7 trained fighters? Those are not good odds. Surrender now, and I'll make it quick. Keep fighting, and everyone in this room dies. Katherine said nothing. She was already flanking. The hospital's layout worked against the insurgents. They positioned themselves in the center of the main tent, which gave them good sight lines but terrible cover. The medical equipment, cots, for stands, monitoring stations, broke up their fields of fire and created blind spots they couldn't cover without spreading too thin. Katherine used those blind spots. She moved along the eastern wall, her footsteps silent on the frozen mud floor, her breathing controlled. The tactical vest she'd stripped from the dead insurgent gave her 4 spare magazines, 120 rounds total. More than enough if she was precise. The first interior kill happened at 23:52. One of the younger insurgents had positioned himself behind a supply rack, covering the south approach. He was trembling, cold or fear, probably both, and his attention was fixed on the main entrance rather than the shadows behind him. Katherine didn't use the rifle. Too loud. The others would hear. The knife from the tactical vest was 6 inches of carbon steel, sharp enough to split hair. She came up behind him, her left hand covering his mouth, her right driving the blade into the base of his skull. He stiffened, shuddered, and went limp. She lowered him to the ground silently. 6 remaining. The next target was 15 feet away, partially visible through a gap in the medical equipment. He was older, more disciplined, the kind of fighter who checked his corners and didn't let his guard down. Taking him silently would be difficult. Katherine didn't try. She aimed through the gap and fired. The round caught him in the chest. He went down, and the hospital erupted into chaos. Contact! Contact! Where? I can't see. Everyone down. Get the hostages. Katherine was already moving. She rolled from her position, came up firing, and dropped another insurgent before he could complete his turn toward her. 3 rounds, 2 hits, 1 kill, 5 remaining. Return fire shredded the air around her. She dove behind a toppled cot, feeling rounds punch through the thin mattress, praying none of them found her. The AK was getting hot in her hands. She fired 15 rounds in the last 30 seconds. She's behind the cot, flank left, flank left. They were adapting. Professional fighters, not amateurs. If she stayed in position, they'd pin her down and execute her. She needed to move again. Katherine grabbed an 4 stand, heavy steel pole, 3 feet long, and hurled it toward the south entrance. The clatter drew their attention for half a second. Half a second was enough. She sprinted toward the communications tent, firing as she ran. Another insurgent went down, clutching his leg, screaming. Not a kill, but disable, 4 effective combatants remaining. Razin, she's heading for comms. I see her. Rounds tracked behind Katherine as she dove through the communications tent entrance. Canvas tore. Equipment sparked. She hit the floor hard, rolled, and came up at a crouch with her rifle pointed at the entrance. Nothing moved. 4 or 5 heartbeats, silence. Then she heard it, footsteps, multiple, spreading out. They were surrounding her. 4 against 1. Enclosed space. Limited ammunition. The math was getting worse. Katherine checked her magazine. 18 rounds remaining. She was going to have to make every one count. At 23:58, the first percussion grenade came through the entrance. Katherine saw it land, a cylindrical shape, bouncing once on the frozen ground, and was already diving for cover when it detonated. The flash turned the world white. The pressure wave felt like being punched by God. She hit the ground blind and deaf, her head ringing, her vision a kaleidoscope of afterimages. Training took over. She rolled left, putting solid equipment between herself and the entrance, and raised her rifle despite the fact that she couldn't see anything. Shapes moved through the flash blindness. Footsteps, commands and Dari. Katherine fired where she thought they were. 1 trigger pull, 2, 3. A body hit the ground. Her vision started to clear. She was in the corner of the communications tent, behind a metal cabinet that had taken 3 rounds meant for her. 1 insurgent was down near the entrance. Chest wound, not moving. 3 remaining. Where was Razin? She found him 45 seconds later. The firefight had spilled back into the main tent, a running battle through overturned equipment and terrified hostages. Katherine had killed 1 more insurgent, a young man barely old enough to shave, his eyes wide with surprise as a round took him in the throat, and wounded another before her magazine ran dry. The wounded insurgent had crawled behind a cot and was bleeding out, too injured to be a threat. She ignored him. That left 2, Razin and his final fighter. They'd retreated to the ICU corner, where Garrett still lay unconscious. The surviving insurgent, a man in his 40s with the hard eyes of a career soldier, was covering the approach with precise, controlled fire. Razin himself was kneeling over Garrett, a pistol pressed to the colonel's temple. Enough! Razin screamed. Stop or I kill him. Katherine stopped. She was 15 feet from Razin, partially concealed behind an overturned medical cart. Her rifle was empty. The tactical vest had 1 magazine remaining, 30 rounds. But switching would take 2 seconds she might not have. The older insurgent had her dead to rights. His rifle was aimed directly at her center mass. 1 twitch of his finger and she was dead. Standoff. Drop the weapon, Razin said. His voice was steady again, the composure restored now that he'd regained some control. Slide it over here. Hands where I can see them. Katherine didn't move. I've already killed 8 of your men, she said. Her voice was calm, professional, a sniper's voice. How many more do you want to lose before you accept that you've already lost? I haven't lost anything. I still have him. Razin pressed the pistol harder against Garrett's temple. And I still have the hostages. If you don't surrender, I'll start killing them. 1 every 30 seconds until you comply. Behind her, someone whimpered. The hostages. her colleagues, her patients. 19 people who would die if she didn't make the right choice. Katherine looked at Razin, looked past the tactical situation, past the threat matrix, past the calculations that had kept her alive for the last 40 minutes. She looked at the man beneath the fighter, a father, a husband, a man whose world had been destroyed by precision-guided munitions and intelligence failures. A man who had every right to want justice for his murdered family. She understood him, and she was going to have to kill him anyway. "You're right," she said quietly. "Garrett deserves to die. What he did to your village, to your family, was a war crime. Even if the investigation clears him, even if he never faces consequences, we both know the truth." Razin's eyes narrowed. "Then why are you protecting him?" "Because that's not my call to make." Katherine's hands were steady. Rock steady. Sniper steady. "Because if I let you execute him, I become you. I become someone who decides who lives and who dies based on my own sense of justice. And I've been that person, Razin. I've made those calls. I've pulled triggers based on bad intelligence and watched innocent people die because someone somewhere decided they deserved it." Her voice broke for just a moment. "I can't do that anymore, even for someone who deserves it." Razin stared at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. Then he shook his head. "You're lying. You're trying to distract me while your rescue forces arrive." He raised a pistol from Garrett's temple and pointed it at Katherine. "I don't have time for philosophical debates. You have 3 seconds to surrender, or I kill you and everyone else in this room." The older insurgent adjusted his aim. His finger tightened on the trigger. Katherine moved, not away from the guns. Toward them, she dropped her empty rifle, dove forward, and came up with the last magazine in her hand. The older insurgent fired. 2 rounds that passed through the space she'd occupied half a second earlier, and then her shoulder slammed into his midsection. They went down together. The rifle discharged between them, the round punching through canvas and out into the blizzard. Katherine's knee found his groin. Her elbow found his throat. The magazine in her hand became a weapon, 30 rounds of ammunition striking his temple with every ounce of force she could generate. He went limp. Razin was screaming, his pistol coming around, and Katherine threw herself sideways as he fired. The round grazed her shoulder, a line of fire across her deltoid, but she was already rolling, already reaching, her hand closing around the fallen insurgent's AK. She came up shooting. 1 round. Center mass. Razin looked down at the hole in his chest with an expression of mild surprise. The pistol slipped from his fingers. He took 1 step backward, then another, and then his legs folded, and he collapsed beside the man he'd come to kill. 9 down. 1 remaining. Katherine found him in the recovery ward. The 10th insurgent, the one who'd been held in reserve, she realized, had separated from the main group during the firefight. He was 19 years old, maybe 20, and he was crying as he huddled behind an overturned cot with his rifle pointed at a patient's head. "Stay back," he said. His voice cracked on every word. "Stay back, or I'll kill her." The patient was Amira, the young translator with the shoulder wound. She was awake now, her eyes wide with terror, too frightened to even scream. Katherine stopped 10 feet away. "You don't want to do this," she said. "You killed them. You killed all of them." The tears were streaming down his face now. "Razin was like a father to me. He took me in when I had nothing. He was going to help me avenge." His voice broke. "Avenge who?" Katherine asked quietly. "My sister." The word came out as a sob. She was 14. She wanted to be a teacher. And that man, that colonel, he pushed a button and she was just gone. Katherine lowered her rifle. "I know," she said. "I know what it's like to lose someone to this war. I know what it's like to want revenge so badly you can't see anything else." She took 1 step forward. "But this girl you're pointing your rifle at, she didn't kill your sister. These doctors didn't kill your sister. And neither did I. You killed Razin. Razin was going to execute innocent people. People who had nothing to do with what happened to your village. People who came here to help. Another step. If you pull that trigger, you become the thing that killed your sister. You become someone who murders innocent people because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time." The young man's hands were shaking. The rifle wavered. "I don't know what else to do," he whispered. "Put down the rifle," Katherine said. Let me help you. For 10 endless seconds, nothing happened. The wind howled outside. The generator rumbled. Somewhere in the hospital, someone was crying. Then the young man lowered his weapon. Katherine moved before he could change his mind. She crossed the distance in 3 quick steps, knocked the rifle aside with her forearm, and caught him as his legs gave out. He collapsed against her, sobbing, and she held a way she might have held one of her patients. 10 down. Everyone else alive. The convoy arrived at 6:20 in the morning. 2 APCs and a supply truck, their headlights cutting to the fading blizzard as they rolled to the hospital's north gate. Soldiers poured out, 20 of them, armed and armored, establishing a perimeter that had been missing for the last 16 hours. Katherine was sitting on a medical crate. When they found her, her shoulder had been bandaged. Sarah Chun had done it, hands shaking, eyes full of questions she didn't ask. And she'd changed out of her blood-soaked scrubs into a surgical gown that provided no warmth, but at least wasn't visibly stained with other people's deaths. The lead officer was a lieutenant colonel named Morrison. He looked at the bodies, looked at the survivors, and looked at the woman who'd apparently dismantled a 10-man insurgent cell by herself in the middle of the blizzard. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. Katherine considered the question. For 3 years, she'd been a nurse, a healer, someone who saved lives instead of taking them. That identity had been real as anything she'd ever known. She'd held dying soldiers and told them they'd be okay. She'd cleaned wounds and administered medication and learned how to put people back together instead of tearing them apart. But tonight, she'd picked up a rifle, and it had felt like coming home. "Master Sergeant Katherine Brennan," she said. Her voice was flat, exhausted. Medical Corps, previously assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment. Sniper qualified. Morrison stared at her. "Your file says you're a night nurse." "My file says a lot of things." She stood, wincing as her wounded shoulder protested. "The accurate version is classified below your clearance level, sir. What matters is that everyone in this hospital survived. Every patient, every staff member, except the insurgents. They stopped being my concern when they started shooting." Morrison looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he saw in her eyes made him take a half-step backward. "There'll be an inquiry," he said finally. "Questions about what happened here. Why the security rotation was compromised. How the insurgents knew Colonel Garrett's location. I'm aware. You'll need to testify. I'm aware of that too." He nodded slowly. "The convoy leaves in 2 hours. You're being transferred to the field hospital in Germany. Orders came through this morning." Katherine didn't react. She'd known this was coming. The moment she'd picked up that rifle, she'd known her time at this hospital was over. She couldn't go back to being just a nurse. Not here, not with colleagues who watched her move through the darkness like something out of their nightmares. They'd saved her and she'd save them, but they would never look at her the same way again. "I'll be ready," she said. The young insurgent was handed over to the arriving forces. He was 19 years old. Katherine had been right about that. His name was Tarek, and he'd lost his sister in the Mirabad airstrike. Razin had found him 3 weeks later, wandering through the ruins of his village, and had recruited him with promises of justice. Now Tarek sat in the back of an APC, his hands bound, his eyes empty. Katherine stopped beside the vehicle before she boarded the convoy. "He's not a monster," she told Morrison. "He's a kid who lost his family and didn't know how to process it. If you can get him into some kind of rehabilitation program instead of a black site." Morrison's expression didn't change. "I'll see what I can do." It was more than Katherine expected, probably less than Tarek needed. She walked away. The convoy left at 8:45. Katherine sat in a lead APC, her back against a cold metal wall, her eyes closed. The rifle she'd carried all night had been taken from her, evidence, they said, for the inquiry. She'd handed it over without resistance, but she could still feel it in her hands. 3 pounds of trigger pressure, the slight resistance before the break, the way the stock settled against her shoulder, solid and familiar. The calculations running beneath her conscious mind, wind speed, distance to target, angle of engagement. For 3 years, she'd told herself she was a healer, that she'd left the killing behind, that she could be something other than what she'd been trained to be. Tonight, she'd learned the truth. The nurse and the sniper weren't 2 different people. They were the same woman, holding 2 different tools. scalpel and rifle, suture and trigger. The hands that had dressed Amira's wounds were the same hands that had put a round through Razan's chest. She'd saved them all, and in doing so, she'd lost the anonymity that had allowed her to save herself. Katherine leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes. Outside, the blizzard was finally dying down. Weak morning light was beginning to filter through the clouds. A new day was starting. But for her, something had ended. She thought about Norway, 600 meters in a wideout, the shot that had made her famous among people whose names she would never know. The moment she'd realized what she was, she thought about the woman with the white bandage, the 27th kill, the trigger pull that had broken her. She thought about Razan, falling beside the man he'd come to kill, the look in his eyes at the end, recognition, maybe, or something like peace. She thought about the life she'd tried to build, the patients she'd treated, the wound she'd healed, the identity she constructed, stitch by careful stitch, from the wreckage of her former self. All of it was real. All of it mattered. But it wasn't enough. The convoy rumbled forward, carrying her toward Germany and an inquiry and a future she couldn't predict. Katherine kept her eyes closed and tried not to think about how much she'd missed a rifle in her hands. She failed. 14 patients survived that night. 3 doctors, 6 nurses, 8 support staff, 28 people who went home to their families because one woman remembered how to be a weapon. The official report would call it heroic action under hostile conditions. The classified version, the one that would be sealed below major level clearance, would tell a different story. The story of a sniper who tried to become a healer and learned that some transformations can't be completed. Katherine Brennan would receive a commendation she didn't want and a transfer she hadn't requested. She would testify at the inquiry and answer questions she'd spent 3 years avoiding. She would eventually return to duty, though never again as a simple nurse. But that morning, as the convoy carried her away from the field hospital, she was just a woman who'd made an impossible choice. She'd picked up the rifle, and she'd saved them all. The sun rose behind the convoy, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. For a moment, the frozen wasteland looked almost beautiful, almost peaceful. Katherine watched it through the APC's rear window and thought about who she would be when this was over. She didn't have an answer, but she knew one thing for certain. She was done pretending to be anyone other than who she was.